History often paints Christopher Columbus as a hero, a visionary who discovered America. But this narrative, passed down through generations, obscures a much darker truth. Columbus's voyages were not journeys of discovery but rather invasions that marked the beginning of centuries of exploitation, enslavement, and genocide for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This essay seeks to unravel the complexities of Columbus's story, challenging the traditional heroic narrative, and revealing a more accurate, albeit unsettling, portrayal of the man and his legacy. By examining the historical evidence with a critical lens, we can begin to understand the true impact of Columbus's arrival in the New World. This exploration is not about demonizing Columbus but rather about confronting the uncomfortable truths that have been glossed over or ignored. Only by acknowledging the full scope of his actions can we begin to grapple with their lasting consequences and work towards a more just and equitable future. One of the most pervasive myths surrounding Christopher Columbus is that he discovered America. This claim, however, ignores the millions of indigenous peoples who already inhabited these lands for thousands of years before his arrival. Columbus did not step onto an empty continent ripe for the taking. He encountered vibrant and diverse civilizations with their own languages, cultures, and systems of governance. To claim that Columbus discovered America is not only inaccurate, but also deeply disrespectful to the original inhabitants of these lands. It perpetuates a Eurocentric worldview that erases the history and contributions of indigenous peoples. A more accurate understanding of history recognizes that Columbus's voyages were not about discovery, but about conquest and colonization. While much is made of Columbus's voyages, his own origins are shrouded in some mystery. The traditional narrative identifies him as Italian, born in Genoa. However, recent scholarship and DNA evidence have cast doubt on this claim, suggesting alternative birthplaces such as Spain, Portugal, and even Poland. This debate over Columbus's birthplace, while seemingly trivial, reflects the ongoing efforts to uncover the complexities of his identity and motivations. It also highlights the limitations of historical sources and the need for ongoing research and critical analysis. Regardless of his precise origins, what is clear is that Columbus was a man driven by ambition, a thirst for wealth and status, and a fervent belief in his own destiny. Columbus's arrival in the Americas had a devastating impact on the indigenous populations he encountered. Driven by a lust for gold and a belief in European superiority, Columbus and his men subjected the native Taino people to unspeakable brutality. They were enslaved, tortured, and murdered, their land and resources plundered in the name of the Spanish crown. Columbus's journals provide chilling accounts of the violence and exploitation inflicted upon the Taino. He describes their enslavement, the forced extraction of gold, and the decimation of their population through disease and warfare. These actions, far from being isolated incidents, marked the beginning of a systematic campaign of genocide and colonization that would have devastating consequences for indigenous peoples across the Americas. While the pursuit of wealth clearly motivated Columbus, his actions were also driven by a complex interplay of religious zeal and a desire for personal glory. Columbus saw himself as an instrument of God, chosen to spread Christianity to new lands and convert the heathen natives. This religious fervor, however, was intertwined with a ruthless ambition. Columbus sought recognition and reward for his discoveries, craving the titles, wealth, and power that came with expanding the Spanish Empire. His actions, therefore, cannot be viewed in isolation, but must be understood within the context of European colonialism and the prevailing ideologies of the time. Section 6. A Legacy Reclaimed Indigenous Voices Rise. For centuries, the dominant narrative surrounding Columbus celebrated his discoveries while silencing the voices of those who suffered as a result. However, in recent decades, there has been a growing movement to challenge this narrative and reclaim the history of indigenous peoples. The establishment of Indigenous Peoples Day, celebrated in many parts of the Americas, stands as a powerful symbol of this shift. This day honors the resilience and contributions of indigenous communities while acknowledging the ongoing struggles they face as a result of colonization. Section 7. Monuments of Contention. The Battle over Columbus's Memory. The debate over Columbus's legacy has also manifested in the calls to remove statues and monuments honoring him. These statues, often erected during periods of intense colonialism and racism, are seen by many as symbols of oppression and genocide. Those who defend these monuments argue that they represent an important part of history and should not be erased. However, critics counter that these statues perpetuate harmful narratives and ignore the perspectives of those who were brutalized and marginalized. The debate over Columbus's monuments reflects a broader reckoning with the legacy of colonialism and the need to create a more inclusive and equitable public space. Section 8. Rethinking History, Embracing a More Inclusive Narrative. Re-evaluating Columbus's legacy requires more than just toppling statues or changing holidays. It demands a fundamental shift in how we understand and teach history. We must move beyond Eurocentric narratives that center on the exploits of explorers and conquerors, and instead embrace a more inclusive history that acknowledges the perspectives and experiences of all people. This means incorporating Indigenous voices and perspectives into our textbooks, classrooms, and public discourse. It means acknowledging the devastating impact of colonization on Indigenous communities and recognizing their resilience and resistance. By embracing a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of history, we can begin to dismantle the harmful legacies of colonialism and create a more just and equitable future. Section 9. A Call to Action. Learning from the Past, Shaping the Future. Examining the true history of Christopher Columbus is not about dwelling on the past, but rather about learning from it and using that knowledge to shape a better future. By acknowledging the atrocities committed against Indigenous peoples, we can begin to address the ongoing injustices they face and work towards reconciliation and healing. This requires a commitment to listening to Indigenous voices, respecting their sovereignty, and supporting their self-determination. It also demands a critical examination of our own biases and privileges, and a willingness to challenge systems of oppression wherever they exist. The legacy of Columbus is a reminder that history is not a static narrative but an ongoing conversation. It is up to us to ensure that this conversation is inclusive, honest, and ultimately leads to a more just and equitable world.